Hello, good evening. I am Rhiana Yazzie. I'm the artistic director here at New Native Theater. And I'm very, very happy that you are joining us this evening for our deep dive into Native theater as we explore how to indigenize the design and tech process. Um, so I am coming to you from Dakota Territory, and would like you to I encourage you to also recognize on whose land that you live. And here at New Native Theater, when we do our land acknowledgements, we really like to ask a few questions because it's really an active process of being here on the land. I drafted these questions a couple of years ago along with Dakota visual artist Angela Two Stars. And so the questions that we like to ask of our audiences at New Native Theater are a few things. First of all is, what is your intent being on this land and in this community? How will you use the new resources, including ideas that you gain by being here? How will you replace the things that you take from here? And how will you carry the knowledge of the Native people, past, present, and future, into the work that you do? And finally, how will you increase Indigenous power and contribute to the Land Back movement? Hashtag Land Back. So, I think this is going to be an incredibly lively conversation because it came up at our our conversations at New Native Theater in the staff as we have been coming back to performing theater after a pandemic that has been so difficult on the entire globe, and especially on Native peoples and Native communities. And we've also had this racial reckoning that started here in the Twin Cities because of the murder of George Floyd. We really have this moment to take a look at what are the structures in the American theater that are unhealthy? What are these white supremacist, imperialistic, capitalistic constructs that need to be broken down and re-examined and decolonized and taken a look at? And as a Native theater company, the onus is really deeply on us if we are following our values and living the way we want. And theater is an extension of strengthening Native people, Native community, and Native artists, and therefore Native tribal communities. So here we are tonight talking about this process with a look at the design and tech process. So I would like to invite our guests to join me here so that we'll have some nice four squares for the hour. I'm really happy to invite costume designer Asa Benally to the room, set designer Mina Kinukawa, and sound and New Native Theater technical director Peter Morrow. So thank you all. Thank you all for being here. Good to see your faces. I usually read a very long bio. And I'm wondering if maybe we could just start the conversation with you telling our viewers just a little bit about you and the work that you do. Asa, could we start with you?
Yeah, hello. My name's Asa Benally, and I'm a costume designer. My gosh. Tell me when I'm at time, because I have a tendency to ramble. God, I've been designing for about 22 years. I've designed, all over the country, and yeah, I don't know what. I'm sure there's more about myself.
You have done so many amazing things, including being one of the few Native graduates of the Yale costume design program. You'll work everywhere. If there is Native theater happening, Asa Benally is making those costumes.
I've worked at New Native Theater, on many shows at New Native Theater. and I'm currently based in New York in Lenape territory. And I'm currently in Canada in, I believe, Haudenosaunee territory. And yes, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Asa. Peter, would you mind introducing yourself?
Sure.
Or I can read the bio that we printed from our show in 2018, Native Woman, the musical, where we accidentally conflated his bio with someone who was running for office. That's not nearly as good as you telling the truth, though.
It's probably more entertaining. But yeah, so I work as a sound and video designer as well as technical director for New Native Theatre. I moved to the Twin Cities from Dublin, Ireland in 2012 and had been working as a sound designer there as well as other things. I taught music in a school for students with autism for about 5 years there also, and ran music nights and other bits and pieces, but primarily worked with one theater company for about 6 years there, and then moved here, and I've been here since 2012. New Native Theatre was my first real theater job here, and I've been working with them ever since for eight and a half years or so, and work with a lot of other theaters around town, mostly in the Twin Cities, greater Twin Cities area.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you. Yes, we always get a kick out of saying that your first job in the U.S. was at a Native Theater company here at New Native Theater. Thank you, Peter. And Mina, will you introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Mina Kinukawa. I'm a set designer. I was born and raised in Tokyo, and having an Italian mother, I got interested in architecture first. Actually, I studied architecture and do interior architecture, and then from there I went back to the theater, the passion that I always had, and that's what brought me to US first for undergrad. I transferred, and then since then, pretty much I've been in and out, a little bit working in Italy, and then coming back, and then since getting MFA long time ago, I stayed, and then I had a chance to work in the film a little bit because I was in California based, but then I've been in Minnesota about 10 years now, and then always enjoyed working with really community focused theater companies.
Thank you so much. It is so good to have you with us. Well, like I was saying in the introduction, so it has been quite a year. It's been quite a year, and there are so many things that need to be changed, things folks would like to be changed as we come back to theater. I'd like to really hear from each of your perspectives. What is wrong with the design and tech process in the greater white American theater? Why does Tech Week have to be so hard? Why are there so few BIPOC people as working behind the scenes? I'd like to hear. I'm just throwing it all out on the table here. What's going on and what needs to change?
Well, I guess I can jump in. Yeah, I mean that's a lot. It's a lot to unpack. I think really when sort of all these questions started coming up, I kind of just looked at, I guess, sort of like how I guess theater is just structured in this country. And it's kind of funny because you had mentioned there's like a point in our lives when like theater was like fun. And I feel like, you go to like any town in America and there's like a community theater. I got my start in community theater, and, as sort of like underfunded and, crazy, everything was about it. It really was something like in, I guess, sort of small town American culture where it was sort of like the only sort of like free activity to do. Like, starting off in community theater in like Flagstaff, Arizona, it's like, that was like the thing that I could go to as like a young person because, you show up and then, you kind of just, somebody like finds a job for you or like you get like, like cast in, some random musical or something. But I think from the beginning, it's just sort of about the access to theater education, which, tends to leave out people of color, really, I think because of just, financial things in one's life, because once you start climbing that ladder, I mean, as a performer, on that end, it's like affording all the singing lessons, music lessons, ballet, tap, or, whatever. I mean, all of that, like, just the price tag of it. I mean, you can't be like a poor person and get into that. And then, so with me, it was sort of like similar because it's sort of like, well, going into like a specialized field of, theater design, I mean, it's just sort of so specialized, and just like having like access to like good training, coupled with the fact that you don't make any money like when you're first starting out, and then have to like, if you have to depend on family support, I mean, a lot of people in the Native community, like, they have like the artistry like within them, but their parents can't afford like $100,000 theater education. So I think, we kind of have to like look back. We have to like look at like when theater careers are starting off.
Yeah.
And who's getting like scholarships because of ability, and then you don't really have a, if you're not as like refined as somebody who's had access to a lot of the training, then that you're already kind of at a sort of disadvantage, like from the start.
And those are the stories of folks who are able to make it, folks who are able to create careers that are livable. I think that point, that also there's this whole thing of apprenticing, groups of people who have someone to support them, whether it's a parent or a really strong support system. Oh yeah, I can apprentice for 4 or 5 years, get to know something without pay. But that just doesn't feel like, it's not a reality when it comes to BIPOC folks. When you saying that, singing lessons, tap lessons, all of those things, and folks are saying, oh, why aren't there more Native actors out there? Why can't we find all of these skills in Native actors, right? And it becomes a catch-22, because first of all, the gatekeeping to keep Native stories off the stage, right? And then the fact that when Native stories do get on the stage, they have to focus on education and non-Native people, and then and the roles that Native people have been offered on stage have been so like Native wallpaper, essentially. How do you design? For that? That's yeah. What are your thoughts, Mina and Peter, about this process?
I think a little bit kind of following up what Asa was saying too about early on education, right? Like, so I think the question is really like how much is higher education institution are reaching out searching for bringing in Native community and backing up with scholarship, right? Like, because, and I think that really there's a lot of prejudice. Well, it's not prejudice because it is hard to make a living in theater, but like, so that's why I feel like the BIPOC students typically even now say they can't afford to go into arts because they have to support their family, and I feel like that's still true. And it's been said for so many years, and still feel like the academia is not supporting in that sense the arts in general. And like you brought up about the wallpaper, I feel like in many cases too, like like we asked to create a visual something it's very symbolic, but there's no depth, or asking audience to question what we're creating, if that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I've literally seen Native people as wallpaper on a couple of regional theater productions in the last 3 years, or the face of a Native person incorporated in a set design, and it's sort of like, how does that happen? How does that image get negotiated? And also just because when you start to get into that inner circle of the power dynamic of producing a play, there's of course there's the artistic director who makes the decision. Then you have your playwright and your director who are making decisions. There's so few Native directors, and when Native folks do get produced in predominantly white institutions, they hardly ever have Native directors. We could even just take a look at the few Native plays that have been done in predominantly white institutions over the last 6-7 years. I can't even think of I can't really think of a Native director unless that director is generative themselves. And then if you only have one Native person in the team, then you're fighting designers who have ideas about, this is how I want to represent your culture. No, this is a metaphor. It means this. It means that. I think that's a really interesting place to start going into. But I want to hear from Peter first. What are your thoughts about this?
I mean, I came into theater having no theater background up until I was whenever I finished my master's and got asked in. And so I feel like I'm very aware of the fact that you don't need to have theater training necessarily, and how adaptable skills in many other areas are to make you very qualified to do lots of things in theater, technical or otherwise. And so whether that is people that are used to doing audio for live music, or work on film, or work on a host of other things, podcasts at this point, the skills that exist in lots of communities in different ways. One of the things with the theater community here is very small, and once you are known, your name does tend to get passed around, but getting in is not like there's not official gatekeepers. But like how do you actually, the effort for those that are not white to break into a largely white group of people does not put you in a comfortable space if you are doing that. And so that kind of is the wall in many ways. And how to create safer spaces in order to not necessarily bring in people who are doing, like, there's issues with academia, and I think in the way that things need to change in the recruiting process and the funding process to make sure there is a diverse group of students in a variety of areas. But some of it is about how we connect as a theater community to the larger community in building bridges to other parts of the community that allows for that community spirit of community theater that you talked about, Asa, and how we can maintain that in order to actually connect outside of the little theater bubble that is there.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of the irony about like why is it so hard, and why are there so few BIPOC technicians and designers, when there is a route into this work that isn't necessarily academia, but it can be apprenticeship. It can be transferring your skills from another area into this. I know, at New Native Theater, I know we always say like, oh, don't we have so many talented seamstresses in the Native community? Like people making regalia. Why is it so hard to cross over some of these things? But it kind of opens up this conundrum of it's not that easy to just jump into theater. It's not just like, oh, I have some skills that can be applied to this because I'm a carpenter. And actually, one of our set designers actually was an Ojibwe architect. And it's sort of like, why is it so hard to jump into theater? And then there's that next layer. What happens when a BIPOC person starts doing theater?
And is not given the support needed to actually succeed at times. If you are coming in with a slightly different skill set that just needs supported and some training, if that doesn't happen correctly, you end up with a bad experience for everybody. And how can we make sure there's appropriate supports in place to make sure that that doesn't happen?
Yeah, I mean, it's like really like complex because like, God, I don't know, thinking about my career, because I mean, it started like really like sort of haphazardly. And, the first like 7 years of my career were like all just like trial by fire. I mean, I really didn't know how to do anything. And every show is kind of like high pressure, high stakes, a lot of disasters. So then, in a way, I was just sort of like, for me at that moment in time, the writing was on the wall where I was just like, you just look at the roster of, Broadway designers, and you're like, oh wow, they all went to Yale or NYU or like these really like major institutions. So then, sort of my thought process, at that point in my life was like, oh, in order to like be a contender, you have to kind of get to like that level to, be noticed in like this market. And really that, for me, sort of like the truth of the matter is that was like really true. Like, when I first moved to New York, I mean, like, I could not get hired anywhere. Like, even for like the 2-person show downtown, it was like, it's like, I'm who from where? I did, what show? Everyone's just like, oh, what shows have you done in New York? Or like, where'd you go to school? And I didn't have the credibility. I didn't have, the top school shine or, all of that. So then I, in sort of like my long-term plan, I was like, okay, well, I'm going to, go to Yale, and then we'll just kind of see what happens. And then of course, like, like less than a year out of, from graduating there, then it was a completely different experience than before I went. And so, yeah, I think everything's just like a catch-22, because it's like, as like a, person of color, you, especially, Native American, you're just like, oh, wow, I'm always like the only, person of color in the room, like at the table. That being said, it's like when I when I went to Yale, that was like really the first time that I started being in the room with like people of color. And I like, you know, definitely took notice of that. And, you know, and this is like 2013, like 2014, like it's not, I'm like, was it long ago? But, you know, it's like, it's not like, you know, it's not, we're not so far removed from that time. So
yeah, 2013 and 2014 seems like eons ago when I think of conversations I've had with predominantly white institutions.
Yeah, because I mean, I always like clock it like 2000. I feel like 2016. It's like that's when like Native theater started sticking. That's when it like started trending. And so I mean, I was like,
because of Standing Rock.
Maybe, I don't know. Like suddenly there were things like being produced, and you know, and it was just kind of like, oh, you know, I mean, I started working like in like 2000, you know, and so I went like 16 years without ever being in the room with another Native theater artist. And so the first show that I did was with the director, Madeline Sayat, and I was just kind of like, it was like a kind of surreal experience. I was like, first of all, I was like, it took this long. And yeah, so it kind of, that's when I kind of like started sort of like seeing like a shift. And then of course that, you know, sort of like brings up a whole other slew of issues, you know, that we have to deal with as Native theater artists now. But it was interesting just to kind of like clock the, you know, the shift in like the culture and the mood. So all of these questions, it's like such a new conversation for it to be, you know, finally people were kind of just like, wait a minute, this culture, this predominantly, you know, white-centered theater culture, like how is that affecting everyone else? Who's like kind of, who've always kind of been on the periphery in a sense.
Yeah, it you know, when you were talking, you brought up a couple of things, high stakes and high pressure. I kind of want to pivot the conversation to that because it feels like, you know, I'm an artistic director of a theater company I started, of a Native theater company that I started in 2009, this one, because of all of these things, the gatekeeping that kept Native stories off the stage, the experiences that I had developing work just began to become so difficult, or it just too much. It was just too many things to deal with for my heart and for my soul. And in creating this theater company, one of the top priorities was it's got to be a safe place. So, but you get to Tech Week. How Tech Week, it seems, is always high pressure, maybe not always high stakes, but it is kind of high stakes when we think of the show must go on mentality, because if it's opening on Friday night and these things aren't done, I mean, everyone's putting in these hours. Some people have slept at the theater many times, or every single time there's a theater, just so that you could put in 18-hour days, 20-hour days. I know that running my theater company, that there were many shows that was the case. How do we change that? What is wrong with Tech Week, and how do we change that? What are your thoughts about that, Mina? We'll start with you.
It's a tough question too. Yeah. I feel like kind of one thing I keep going back to in this conversation of why is the tech the way it is, something I learned to appreciate when I was working in film, that somebody told me, you don't run. You never run on set. I mean, safety, but also because if you've done your work, you don't have to run. Like you planned everything. And of course, even though something was falling apart, you have a plan for backup. So that's something I feel like the theater, it's not there. Everything is last minute. And you're told from the beginning that if this is not done by this day, you have to sleep in the theater to finish it. Which is, yes, I mean, if you don't have another job that's supporting your living, or you don't have family that you have to go back to, like pick up from daycare or, you know, feed, then sure, I can afford to put in 20 hours. But, you know, so I feel like there's like a two-minded in that sense. So like, why are you doing that? And when does the miscommunication happen, or what was expected to happen by tech? Why is it not happening? Yeah, I think those were my questions.
And you know, it brings up something that we talked about on staff that I never even considered, because from my perspective as the artistic director or a director of a play, I'm looking at all of these pieces, and I just assume like, okay, all the technicians and the designers, they got it. But this thing about the concept of consent came up in a conversation we had at one of our production meetings at New Native Theater. Since January, we have had intentional Wednesday production meetings to look at slowing down the process and trying to not recreate all of these structures that are harmful, you know, and it feels to me like it's not consensual to force a person to sleep in a theater all night so that they can get this stuff done. It seems to me, again, antithetical to the joy, to the reason why we even got into theater. And then we're not even, you know, and all I'm talking about is like literally my experience as an artistic director here in the Twin Cities. And we don't get reviewed. Star Tribune doesn't come to see our shows. A Pioneer Press doesn't. When NPR does an article about us, it's usually like, hey, look at that unicorn. Catch it before it goes. It's never about, look at the art, look at this, and look at that. And yet we still fall into these things of I can remember so many days where I'm done with the rehearsal and Peter is still there. And like, oh no, I'm probably going to be here another 2 hours, another 4 hours. And it's a terrible feeling. And yeah, and this idea of consent, like, I don't think anyone consented, like, oh, I'm going to get into this field and I'm going to have to, in order to do this, not have a family. The most successful people at it who can do it don't have family, don't have kids. I don't. And what is that all about? And how can we stop doing that? How can we create a week or longer time period where, oh, it's end of the day, it's time to pick up the kids, oh, it's time to meet with friends, it's time to decompress. You can actually leave it here, walk away, have a life, come back the next day. Because it happens, it happens all along the financial strata of theater. It's not just, oh, we're doing this because we don't have money, but maybe theater doesn't have money in general. I don't know. What are you thinking about that, Peter? Because we had we have been having these conversations in the staff meetings for so long.
Yeah, I mean, money certainly plays a part of it. Well, depending on, again, there's so many layers.
I think your connection is getting a little wonky, Peter.
Okay.
Oh no.
Let me leave
Oh,
and
you're
come
back.
back.
You're back.
Am I back?
Yeah.
Let me try leaving, or am I back
Oh,
fine?
you're great now. Yeah.
Okay, great. I think for Tech Week itself, like, I don't know who came up with the original schedule, but it certainly is, like, when we look at the hours that people work, it is based around the time that the directors can be in the room. So if you were to look at non-union houses, certainly this is the minus in the country. For example, there's a cap at the end of the day
Oh,
when
Peter, we're getting you as a robot again. I really want to hear what you're saying too.
let me
Okay, all right. Asa, do you want to jump in so Peter can go out and come back in?
Yeah. Kind of like what I got, what part of you was saying is like, I think if you really like traced it back to how somebody did something, you know, decades ago, and we're still kind of like living with this sort of like idea or structure of sort of, I guess, what Tech Week has been. But I'm kind of just in this situation where I'm like, it's been sort of just like, well, it's just kind of like all I know. Like, I've been in this system for so long, and that's kind of just, you know, I guess what I've just always been used to. But I do think that, you know, when I worked with institutions that have had more money, you know, and tech has been like maybe like 2 full weeks just of tech in a theater space versus, you know, working on a show where, you know, out of necessity because of, you know, maybe the theater's being rented or the space is being rented, you know, that you kind of have to just like condense, you know, it's sort of like, okay, let's do tech for, you know, especially like doing, you know, shows in New York with theaters that don't own their own spaces. I think that's probably maybe like a really big factor to it. It's just sort of like, okay, well, we're going to do tech in like 1 or 2 days. And then anything else will be like hashed out in our very short preview period. And then we're going to do our run. So, and I think a lot of it also has to do with, or a lot of sort of the unhealthy aspects of our theater culture have to do with the fact that, you know, me as like a costume designer, you know, like at my busiest, you know, I probably was working on like 5 or 6 shows, you know, that kind of like, there's like these 4 shows, and then these 4 shows kind of, you know, like fit. And then that creates like a livable, you know, financially like a livable, you know, income. But then your schedule is like so packed that you're kind of just like, you know, sometimes running back and forth, or, you know, jumping out of the frying pan into the fire sort of thing. And I think just also that culture of just like, we have to like pack in as much as we can, either like in the time we're allotted, or the schedule that or the time that a designer is allowed to like kind of spend on a show. It's just sort of like all these different factors. And I don't know if a lot of it also has to do with like this concept of like the academic day ends at like 5, or there's like that 9 to 5 mentality. But then in theater, it's just sort of like, okay, you'll have the 9 to 5, and then you have a dinner break, and then you have like, you know, 6 to midnight, and then you have your post-production meeting, and then, you know, yeah. So I mean, I think in a perfect world, like every theater would have all the money that they would need to kind of like spread out the process a little bit more. But then that means changing like a whole lot of other things. Because if like, you know, if people are still getting paid the same, you know, it's like I'm still in the scenario of like, well, I still have to like pack in as much as I can into my calendar.
Yeah.
To like make that livable wage, which probably isn't that livable to begin with, you know. It's just sort of like this sort of like domino effect that's happened. But now it's like, how do we like reverse that? Yeah.
Yeah, kind of. I agree. Like, you know, like somehow the designers are expected to do their work in 2 days versus the rest of rehearsal took 6 weeks, 4 months, but we are there only for those 2 days. That's the only time we get to make changes, adjustment. But like Asa said, but then, yeah, great if you can get started earlier, but if the pay is the same, then we can't spread ourselves out so long. So, yeah.
It comes down to this sort of like capitalistic structure where, because I'm a theater company that doesn't have its own space. We do rent, and when I think of cause and effect factors make tech hard, it's like, yeah, we have a week. We do a week of tech, so we have the rental, but that's never enough time. It's never enough time, um, and then also what it's such a chicken and egg thing, and it's so frustrating. I think it also kind of goes back to looking at, I think there's so many layers of this because it's like we don't, as a country, we don't value artists. We don't value creativity. And what that really means is we don't value vulnerability, sensitivity. We don't value introspection, and we don't value all of the things that sitting quietly with a piece of art allows the body, the nervous system, the mind, and the spirit, and the culture, and the society to just stop for a minute, pull yourself together. And it's just so endemic for everything that we're doing. So then you're a native theater company. You don't walk in that worldview, right? I know, growing up with a Navajo father, I have I look at the world differently. That is this different worldview. But I come to theaters, and I have to, we have to change ourselves to fit into these structures if we can be successful. Right. But then it's antithetical to Native people, to BIPOC people who have been living with all these deficits, high stress environments, when the most creative and thoughtful and forward thinking for bringing ideas out into the world, into the system, these people don't have enough money with the work they're doing to even create families and stability for themselves. I think there's this promise of predominantly white institutions when they handpick artists, or when they handpick BIPOC folks. Like, we have this promise for you that once you get produced, you're going to get produced everywhere. You're going to have a life. You're going to have a career. And so if you just wait a few years before you believe you can buy a house, believe you can settle down and have a family, we're gonna the larger structure of the theater or this capitalistic system is going to deliver to you. But it doesn't. It doesn't, because it's capitalistic and imperialistic, and it's always looking for the best next thing. It's looking for the money. And ironically, it's not even looking for the best art. And I can tell you a couple examples of that's out there in the world, with an announcement of a couple of seasons. It's such a so let's take all these layers, and let's talk about livable income. What does that mean? How can we create livable incomes? Why don't we just say it out loud? What's a livable income for a designer? I would like everyone to know.
I don't know. Like, the thing is, the most financially stable year that I've had in my life was also like the most like miserable year of my life. Because it was sort of like, Lucy in the Chocolate Factory. It's like you're just like trying to grab, as much, and you're trying to keep up with like this like machine of a system. And I just like kind of had a moment. I'm like, wow, this is like the most money that I've ever made, but it doesn't come close to like, probably what other people would think is a livable wage. But then I kind of just had this reckoning with myself where I was just like, I'm never going to do this again. Like, I'm never going to like continue to like accept work just because I'm like, okay, it fills a slot. It like it pays whatever this, you know, portion of, you know, the rent or, you know, monthly bills or whatever. So, you know, pre-pandemic, I like kind of, you know, I really sort of like held myself to that. And I think that kind of, you know, now that things are kind of opening up again, I kind of just have to like remind myself of that. Like, it's just sort of this like blind faith that if I, you know, if I trust like in the art, that it will take care of me, but like not thinking that the art is, you know, guaranteed work or whatever.
Yeah, it's hard.
Mm-hmm.
You can hear me, but not see me. Is that right?
Yeah. Hey, Peter. All right, we got your voice.
I don't know why the connection. I tested the bandwidth and it's like super fast, but I can't. Anyway, I'm going to talk to you without seeing me. That's the way it'll go.
All right, Peter.
But the balance of trying to figure out how much is enough. I mean, some of that is dependent on how, if you have a family to support, if you have like as a single person, I can live pretty cheaply. And there's a point at which the more shows I do, the more expensive life is, because I have to eat out more. My driving expenses are more, and quality of life drops considerably, even if I am making more money on paper. I'm not really making more when I look holistically at life at that point. Like the year that I did 30 shows was
what?
Oh
Yeah.
my God.
That was a low point or a high point. I don't know which. And I really like to be busy, because if I wasn't doing this, I would do it as a hobby for parts. So I have redirected some of that energy into things like playing music with friends, playing in bands, and I've done more of that type of thing in the last couple of years. Again.
Oh, you sound a little like
a robot. Into a robot again. Oh no.
Oh no.
Yeah, no, like he was just saying what, you know, that's like true. It's like, you know, the thing is, it's like, I guess I saw like the wizard behind the curtain. I had the wizard behind the curtain moment, because, you know, just finding out that, you know, people who were even though they were at like the height of their career, even though they were working on Broadway or doing a lot of, you know, these big shows, you know, and just kind of like seeing that even at that point, you know, people mentally were still like still worried about finances, still worried about money. And then I just kind of was like, oh wait, so that never changes. It's like, I could be designing, you know, like on Broadway, but it's like that mentality will just like always be there, of just like, it's like feast or famine. Mm-hmm. So I don't know what that could be going forward. It's like, or if that, you know, how much of that is going to like change.
Yeah. So that brings up another layer, right? Oops, you can hear I didn't turn my cell phone off. So that brings up another layer, is when you look at the most successful folks out there on Broadway who are even still trying to patch lives together, then it's the work, and then it's the people, the plays that you're working on. When these shows that we work on, when there's no joy, when there's, I'm going to say there's no point to the show, where the show is not pushing us forward as a society, it's not calling into question the status quo, and it's not doing the deeper work that it could. And then you ask yourself, why am I doing this? Do you ever have moments like that when you're interfacing with the art versus like, okay, quantity means food and a roof over my head, and then do you have these moments of like personal, like, what am I working on? What's the meaning of this? And then you throw in the extra layer on that layer of cultural appropriation, of Native people being erased from narratives, um, uh, the history of oppression of BIPOC people. I don't think that white artistic directors or people in power, predominantly white institutions, think about these things. You know, Pequin of yeah, go ahead. I was going to say, go ahead. You were going to say something.
If you're telling stories about how we think of it to be just a very hypocritical process to not make people know. Can you make out what I'm saying?
It's Peter, sorry. I don't know why the StreamYard gods have not looked favorably upon you tonight.
Sorry.
It happens.
I think it's because we're trying to actively decolonize this. We are trying to bring up some really tough stuff. Pequin of Death says in a comment that went by, love that you're directly addressing what so many other companies are avoiding talking about in terms of recognizing that theater artists are also people that need to take care of themselves. We have a Peter Morrow fan who says that Peter usually never has any internet issues, but he does tonight.
Well, I guess like one thought, you know, that I have in terms of like the Native perspective, it's like most of the time it's sort of like it's such a solitary sort of, you know, experience, like you had, you know, had mentioned earlier, Rhiana, where it's just sort of like if you're like whatever point you are in the team, you know, it's usually, you know, it seems like when you start going into like different territory, you are like one of two natives, or you're the only native, you know, and then that puts you like in a very vulnerable position. Mm-hmm. And, you know, just kind of looking at African American theater, I mean, even if you're a predominantly, you know, white institution and you produce an August Wilson play, it's like, you know, that there's like a core group of actors and, you know, directors and, you know, people coming in who can like support each other. And so I always like have admired that and kind of have been, you know, I'm like, oh man, I wish like we had that, because we, you know, it's like this whole, I think, aspect of theater trying to control narratives in a way, when it's sort of like, well, you know, if you're a predominantly white institution and you're producing a native work, you just kind of have to like have this mentality, like fund it and then get out of the way. Mm-hmm. Like, you know, we know what we're doing. But there's always, you know, I've been in situations where, you know, it's like, oh yeah, I'm like, you know, the New York costume designer, the Yale costume designer, you know, all those whatever, like, you know, scout badges or whatever. And it's like, you know, but people were kind of, you know, still skeptical. Like, can you really like pull this off? Can they really, you know, do they really know what they're doing? Just kind of like these, you know, microaggressions in a way. And yeah, I think it's just like a very sort of like complex issue, but I think the most, you know, successful native, you know, themed work has always, that's what I've noticed, is that, you know, theaters and artistic directors just know to like step back, you know, because they believe in the talent. Like, we have nothing to prove to like the people who've brought us on and the people who've hired us. Mm-hmm. And then the worst case scenarios where, you know, people you know, who've hired us or hired me, but then don't, you know, like on some basic level, don't think that I know what I'm doing.
Mm.
As a designer, as a person of color who's a designer, I don't know. Yeah, that's something that I've noticed from
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah. Have you experienced similar things, Mina?
I feel like there are a couple of things, like Asa was saying, you know, like being questioned, right? And that kind of goes back to what we earlier were talking about. It's difficult to break into theater until you have that first couple shows, then everybody know you. But until you have those shows, right? And being a BIPOC person or immigrant, you know, like you have extra barriers there. And then I feel like we are put in a place that now we do need the larger institution to give us a chance, or, you know, try and fully, like Asa said, you just fund it and trust me, trust the designer, trust the director, trust the production team to do their work. And I also do believe that being a BIPOC person and being mixed race Asian, I feel like I oftentimes called upon designing for Asian plays, Asian American plays, just because I'm Asian, right? So like it's a kind of stereotypical thing, but I think because I've been put on that position so many times, I feel like I have that sensibility. Like I have that sensibility to actually care for the work, to read correctly.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, again, going back to the trust of, like, you know, like give us the chance of me and the younger generation, I think, to come.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, that gatekeeping, that won't trust us to tell our own stories is so incredibly frustrating. I'm reading some of the comments here. So Inez put in, um, um, I'm having a little tough time reading it. I think it's up on the screen. And I know that there's a lot of issues in this, and but I feel like when we keep going back to this organizing principle, or this original reason why we got into theater, joy, the thing that made you alive, the thing that you were like, that's why I'm on this planet, is because I can express myself through this in the most profound way, and that's how I see myself reflected back the best. Can you tell me about some of the best experiences that you have had when you made your work and you were seen and you were with a team? Can you tell me a little about some of those experiences that you'd like to see happen more often and replicate?
All right, here we go. I'll try.
I was like,
Okay, do we have to stop right like at 8, or
we don't have to stop.
Okay, I was
Okay.
Treasure. I don't know. That's like really complicated. Like I have this. I guess like one thing that I've learned was like you think that like the biggest, you know, sort of, you know, fanciest thing on your resume, or, you know, the biggest fanciest show that you do is the best thing. It's like the best experience. I mean, sometimes it's like the opposite. It's like, you know, probably not like the worst, but maybe it's just like, you know, maybe you're just dealing with a lot more, you know, a lot more of the crap. But I feel like the most, a lot of like the best experiences have been really the stuff that, you know, I didn't have like big budgets for or didn't have time for. But, you know, the thing that, you know, was really special about it was just like being like within, you know, my community, you know, being within an Indigenous community. So it's really also, it's really like, I think about the people. the people that you surround yourself with at the end of the day, and how you really treat people. You know, because I've like seen the you know, the most illustrious people, you know, act a fool, and you know, and you're just kind of like, how can you like continue to exist like that? And so for me, I guess it's just about focusing on, I guess, like the spirit that I bring to something and the spirit that, you know, other people bring to something. And that's the thing that, you know, in hindsight, I'm like, that's the thing for me that really, you know, makes to create a special experience.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree very much. Like the community and the people you work with, and I feel like that's one thing I've learned to do is to I have to have something that matters to me to do a show, and oftentimes that involves, you know, the director or other designers or the playwright that I respect. And then I feel like that makes a huge difference, especially in the difficult times like a tech and everything's falling apart. Hi, Peter.
He's back.
Welcome. Hey.
Yeah, and I think kind of similar to Ace, I think my best experience is when I worked with marginalized community, I should say. Yeah. But we kind of all spoke the same language, I think.
You know, with me, it's like everyone that I'm working, you know, if I'm working in a theater where I, you know, have like assistants or, you know, costume shop or anyone like that, I'm always just like, my mentality is just like, oh my God, yes, thank you. This is, you know, so amazing to have this, you know, this support. And, you know, I like respect that and appreciate that.
Yeah, yeah. So sewing spoons onto the Nanabush costume was not one of your favorite experiences. I'm kidding. You made such a wonderful question. I'm kidding. Yeah,
that's you know, that's like the essence of like Indigenous theater.
Yes, sewing spoons onto a costume.
Being like, what do I have? Like, what can I, you know, make out of the things that are just, you know, around me?
I think we're still using those spoons to stir our coffee here in the office.
I probably bought a lot of them, maybe when I was overboard getting materials. But
every time I find one with a hole at the end, I think twice about putting it in my mouth. Yeah, I would also have to say that the moments that have been the most joyful have been those moments where you have the time to just sit and talk with people and connect and get to know folks. And you know, one of the tenets of white supremacy is urgency, and that just seems always so hard to get away from, this concept of urgency in putting a play together. That's one of the focuses that we're really looking at this year, as we're trying to reimagine what does a process look like. How does it feel better? So we've been spreading out this production as long as we can. So New Native Theater will be having an outdoor production in September. And there's just been so much conversation that has come up to try and get us there. And also we're not subscribing to the show must go on mentality. If, you know, we're also in a pandemic. I keep saying to the staff, slow down. We are not the ones who are creating the vaccine. So we can slow down. We can afford to pause. We don't need to be urgent. And whenever we can center joy and happiness in the work we're doing, then that's the best barometer to know is it working? Is it working well? That is my personal take. I'm going to read a couple of these comments. So it looks like Pennequin of Death is sent us another, emailed us at info@newnativetheater.org, a resource that is trying to figure out what a good wage is for Twin Cities designers. And anybody who is interested in seeing that resource, because there weren't enough characters in the comments, so it couldn't get dropped into the comments. But if anybody wants that, please send us an email at info@newnativetheater.org. And we spell theater the bougie way with R-E at the end instead of an E-R, because the bougie natives. And and then also another question, which I will, Peter, I don't know. Yeah, thank you. If you are comfortable doing so, do you have recommendations for approaching companies about their behavior in hiring people for their mechanism rather than their skill? Do you have thoughts about that?
I don't know. I feel like on one hand, it wasn't until I started working like on more native productions that I kind of realized that like in some like roundabout way that, my presence, was used to like legitimize certain, works, or like certain projects. And I think in those like, so then that kind of, became sort of like a red flag too, because I was just like, well, my first, questions are, who are the other natives in the room? Are there like, who are the natives like back in the office? Like where, it's like, where's like the Indigenous representation? Like no matter, in any context. And that's always kind of sort of been like my barometer. So then if I find that I'm like going to be like the solitary person in a situation now, I just kind of, have like, I kind of knew what to sort of look for. I think my years before, I started doing more native works. I mean, I don't think anyone even knew, unless like I told them or I'm wandering through a space. I mean, they probably didn't even know that, there was like a native person there. But it's like,
Yeah.
So I think it's just like finding, I guess, like who's the team, who's producing it? Like, am I going to be like the only person to like legitimize, a project? Yeah.
Yeah. It is lived experience, trial by fire that, unfortunately, as we go on in this career, we start to see, okay, yeah, what are the red flags? And we start navigating everything around those, unfortunately, because there have been so many of those in the past, Mina, do you have some thoughts about this question?
Yeah. I think like, like you said, we all being there, and then unfortunately I feel like that's most like a lot part of my career is being questioning that, right? Am I the token or but yeah. Then like right, the question is then do we want them to stop hiring BIPOC or native designers and artists? So always there's the balance, because we do want people to hire BIPOC artists, but then if we, and I think Asa had a very good point. I think knowing your team, who else is there, like why you, right? Why me, right? Why was I brought in? I think that's a big question to ask.
Do you feel like you have the power to request a team to say, well, I can only work on this project if this happens and that happens, and if you hire, do you feel like you can make those kinds of negotiations at this point in your careers?
I think I'll go to the director, have a conversation with the director, and I'll bring it up as a team, as a member of a team.
Yeah, I feel like that is very much like, well, in the past, it's been, you know, all initiated by the director, you know, and sometimes, you know, from my understanding, that's like a whole, you know, battle unto itself, because like some theaters will be like, well, you know, we only have like this list of designers we like working with.
Mm-hmm.
Choose from the list.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I've had directors who have like fought for me to like be contender, to get on the list, and then, you know, to be hired. And, you know, even as like, so I think like in terms of like the tokenism, for me, it's like I've had to like probably like fight to be like the token native, because like there, you know, with like some larger theaters, they've just been, you know, like no. We have our list of these designers who we've worked with for years, da 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 da. So yeah, I mean, it's just like so nuanced and, you know,
Yeah,
I guess more complicated than I, you know, sort of realized. But I feel like I've kind of reached this like place where I guess where when I question like where are the other Indigenous people, you know, like if I'm like given an offer or, you know, directly, because sometimes I'm like hired, you know, by a company and not by the director, although it's usually the director, you know, bringing me in. But you know, so those situations do come up where I kind of just sort of realize that, you know, I guess like maybe I have more agency than I thought I did. And maybe it's just this like period in time we're in when, you know, if we're being brought into a space that we like can question, like who else is going to be there? Is there going to be somebody who looks like me? You know, because before it was just like, I think just like the mentality of just like, you know, being a more up and coming designer at one point, you're just kind of like happy to like get any job. And like, you just don't question anything because you're just so grateful to be in the room. But now I'm like, now in my old age, I'm starting to realize that, you know, I maybe I have more agency than I thought like possible. So.
And I love saying that word in rehearsal rooms this year. Agency. Don't you have agency? You have agency as a Native person. You have agency as a BIPOC person, and just never forget that there you have it. I want to respect the time, so we're going to start to close this down. But this is a really one more question here. I'm just going to ask you two more questions, this one and the next. So we know that the pipeline for non-white people is virtually non-existent. When you were getting started, what do you wish companies had done to welcome you into the art?
Wow, I have to like think.
I wish they'd just welcomed.
I think for me, it just was, I think about the, you know, material that people did, you know, because I started off, like my way into theater was really about, it was like the American theater canon. It was like, you know, more like musical theater, you know? So there was like, I was just working on all these projects that had, you know, I guess that I couldn't like relate to, like, you know, on an Indigenous level.
Yeah.
but I don't think that type of work was, I don't know if it was ready to be produced back then, but yeah,
Yeah, I think me too. This is so long ago now, but also feels like after having experienced like a European style of theater education that you apprentice, like you said, forever and ever, coming to the States and see people were willing to try you out as a young artist was very, very refreshing. So I was like very, I will do anything, kind of thing. So I mean, I would design for any small shows. But so I feel like I have a very different relationship to that question, I think. Yeah, and then like I said, I wish they just welcomed me. I feel like they will just welcome you like any other designer. Like, but yeah, right. Ideally, we don't get differentiated because
I know. I think really, I think I came up with the answer. I think just being a part of like the canon, in terms of like academic American theater, I happened to like experience, like Spider-Woman theater back in 1999, and like my mind was blown. And then it was like, but then there was like nothing else, I think like being within like a learning space when it came to theater, since basically, everyone's doing land acknowledgements, it's like if universities are doing land acknowledgements, put native playwrights into the canon, like at least 4 plays. That's a good number, right? Like,
it's a sacred number.
Yeah, sacred number. So like doing Res Sisters, like
yeah, a classic that
Spider-Woman, Spider-Man theater. Like there is stuff that exists, that's
been vetted, and if they need something vetted, there are things that have been vetted. Not that new work isn't can't just jump right in, but yeah, anyway, sorry to interrupt you. It just gets so
I think that's that would be my answer.
Yeah. I think Peter's joined us for the. Are you there, Peter?
Yeah,
okay.
Just to say goodbye.
All right. Well, thank you. I do want to thank you all for taking the time for this conversation, and we've extended the time on this conversation because it just felt so so important to say these words and to have this subject. Before we go, what is when you imagine that you're going back and you're in the best possible situation, what is your indigenized design and tech experience look and feel like? How can we? What is that? And we're creating this new world. We're all gonna start making theater in. What is that beautiful indigenized world that you're walking into?
Oh, for me, I'll just jump right in. Taking I think just taking on a very basic level, taking a lot of breaks. I'm really into breaks right now, and that really in the context of my life right now means leaving the workspace and going and laying out on a patch of grass or hanging out with some trees, not to sound so that native, but I mean it's true. It's just I found myself doing a lot of that. I'm currently doing the Res Sisters again at here at
Bradford.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, what's Zach?
And that's what I've been doing. I've just been okay, I'm gonna go look at caterpillars, or I saw a snail the other day, and I just kind of hung out with it. And just like taking that moment, you know, and I don't, and so it's, for me, it'll be just like translating it into, you know, when I go back to New York, like, what does that mean when you're in a city? What does that mean when you kind of like re-enter this like machine in a way? But yeah, I think that's like one of like the first steps, you know, because in hindsight, I'm like, well, that's what I did when I was like a kid. You went off and you wandered the hills, you know, you had that space. And now, you know, I realize now that's like a luxury. Didn't think that at the time, but just kind of being quiet, being still, not feeling I have to like rush around and get like 20 things done like in an hour. Because, yeah.
I think mine might be a little practical, maybe, but I feel like I wish I'm asked what I need to make my work successful. I feel like the last year or 2 years been a lot of being asked how we can help, but I feel like I haven't been asked what could have helped me being successful.
Yeah. And such a simple, basic relating question, right? Just checking in with you. How are you? And it's in the theater's best interest. What can we do to help you do you better and feel good in this space? Seems like such the simplest question to ask of all the artists, right?
Yeah.
Peter, what does your perfect indigenized theater look like when you come back?
I mean, it is about the priority being making sure people are taken care of in the process. And yeah, I mean, I think that is key to me, and how that pans out for everybody, whether that is time for conversation or time to sit outside on the grass for a little bit together, and like, what does it mean to be in community together as we create a thing? Like, real collaboration is more than just getting a job done. There's a support as well as a doing, and how that all plays out in the room, with like there's a care taken of each other. Those have been the special places for me when those happen, in the way that a room is held by, like, you just hold each other, not physically, but like you can feel it. Yeah.
Oh, well, that is such a wonderful place for us to go ahead and segue back into our caterpillars, our trees, our couches, our children, our family, and our friends. And I want to thank all three of you for everything that you are doing to make our theater so beautiful, so thoughtful, and so connected and loving. And I'm excited to, and I know I'm going to work with y'all again very soon. And we're getting a lot of love in the comments as well. Rowena, hey, out there. All right. Well, thank you again, and we'll keep these conversations up. We have these conversations, a deep dive into Native theater, the last Monday of every month, and they do stay up on our YouTube channel, so you can revisit them, you can share them, and I know for sure I'm going to be resharing this conversation, and hoping that people can hear these thoughts, and maybe make this chain reaction start going, right? All right. Well, thank you again, and have a wonderful, wonderful evening. Thanks, everybody.